We are so fortunate to be joined this morning by one of the country's biggest champions for fathers, especially for fathers of color, Dr. Ron Mincy. Many of you had the privilege to hear Ron move the audience to action at our first Fatherhood Summit 5 years ago. Well, he is back, and he has not slowed down. Dr. Mincy is a professor at Columbia University, where he directs the Center for Research on Fathers, Children, and Family Wellbeing. And you can read his bio to learn all about his vaulted degrees and numerous awards and the impactful public service contributions that he's made, along with the countless books and articles that he's written on social welfare issues, child support, and opportunities to support fathers. But what you won't read in his bio is that he has been such an important mentor to me and to many others. When he was a senior program officer at the Ford Foundation, he collaborated with a group of scholars at Princeton and Columbia to design the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study. And the results of this ongoing study have provided previously unavailable insights into the needs of our most vulnerable families and also into their resilience. It was the first and most robust study to interview fathers in addition to mothers and to help us to gain a better understanding of family dynamics and the relationships that parents have with their children. And as a doctoral student at Princeton many years ago, I used this study for my dissertation, and it has fed my career moving forward. But I am only one of dozens of students that Ron's inspiration and dedication has supported. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ron Mincy.
Good morning, everyone. So Cynthia, thanks so much for that very generous introduction. And I am really glad to be back after this period in order to say hello to your audience again and introduce them to what will be a great conference. My charge today is to talk about the areas in which I think interventions involving fathers are most needed. And then I want to do just three things briefly to identify what those areas are, to try to clarify some nuances in those areas, then to talk about why I think these are the top priority areas, and to make a few suggestions about how they might be accomplished. So first, what types of interventions and supports do fathers need? And for the most part, I'm going to be talking about non-resident fathers. However, I think some of these comments are relevant for resident fathers as well, particularly those who have less than a college degree and who are struggling to sustain their families. I think for the non-resident fathers, I think the foremost is to increase fathers' capacity to improve child well-being by engaging fathers and children directly in developmentally and relationally appropriate parenting programs for children between 0 and 18 years old. Secondly, I think it's to improve the way fathers generally adapt to numerous stressors. And finally, to enable fathers, particularly non-resident fathers, to advocate for child support orders that more realistically reflect their ability to pay. So I want to talk, these ideas come out of research projects that I've been involved in over the first 2 years. Not to say that they're the most important research areas, but this is what I know as a consequence from my own work. First, so what services and supports, why do I say develop? What do I mean by developmentally and relationally appropriate parenting programs, and why fathers need to be engaged in them? In the first place, we have no trouble thinking about what it means for a parenting program to be developmentally appropriate. You want to be providing children with skills for which they are developmentally ready to enter. So you wouldn't, if you had an intervention aimed at an 8-year-old, it wouldn't be to try to get the 8-year-old to understand that his or her actions affect the environment. On the other hand, if you're working with an infant or toddler, even one of those little activity centers in which they push a ball, and as a result of pushing the ball, they see that the ball moves and rings, that's the kind of developmentally appropriate activity for an infant or a toddler. So we don't have an issue with understanding that parenting programs need to be developmentally appropriate, but I also think they need to be relationally appropriate. And this is what I mean. We want parenting programs, particularly those that not only teach fathers skills, but also engage fathers in direct interactions with children, particularly non-resident fathers. We want to have these programs that screen fathers and mothers to allow the appropriate amount of interaction to actually occur. So that is to say, one of my real concerns in the development of parenting programs is that they very rarely engage non-resident fathers directly with children, because researchers are really unclear about the nature of relationships between non-resident fathers and the mothers of their children. And they don't understand how frequently they will be able to interact. And as a result of that uncertainty and not wanting to go into that uncertain relational space, we're not getting much development in direct father engagement programs with respect to non-resident fathers. And I think, therefore, we need to have parenting programs in which fathers are engaged. We need to have some of these serving non-resident fathers of children of various ages, and we need to begin to figure out how to better understand the relationship of non-resident fathers and the mothers of their children, so that we won't just ignore the non-resident fathers, but we'll figure out where can this interaction take place, what kinds of mother and father pairs who are no longer romantically involved, or sometimes they are, how much interaction can we have based upon better understanding the relationship between non-resident fathers and the mothers of their children. Let me move on to the next topic. What kind of strategies am I talking about when I think about the idea that fathers are exposed to a variety of stressors, and we need to be more focused on helping them manage those stressors in an adaptive way as opposed to a maladaptive way. First, so I'm talking about things like helping fathers develop strategies like taking time out or walking away from a stressful situation, as opposed to handling a stressful situation in ways that involve violence, for example, especially domestic violence. How to help fathers develop strategies such that when they're stressed out, they go get some exercise. They go and punch on a punching bag or play a game of basketball where they can freely elbow their opponent, rather than take out their stress in a way that may involve some abuse or domestic violence. Sometimes and often, what we know from the research is that men and women, males and females, handle stress differently. Women tend to handle stress often by overeating, by becoming withdrawn and showing signs of depression, while men tend to maladapt to stressors by alcohol abuse, substance abuse, and the like. These maladaptive strategies then vary between males and females, and men need to be, fathers especially, need to be taught about the pro-adaptive, or rather the adaptive strategies for managing stress. And these will include things like awareness meditation, and often drawing upon their own faith traditions, so that when they get stressed out, they can, many of you will know what I'm talking about, they will give their challenges to the Lord, and as a consequence, manage the stress in a way that enables them to get through a stressful situation and move on. Finally, planning and goal setting. Many fathers get into circumstances where they have to achieve many things at the same time, and they are overwhelmed with the responsibilities that land on their plate at any given time. I have to fix my car. I have to get a job. I have to maintain my child support order. My child has been late from school, and all of this is happening at the same time. And the simple need to deal with multiple stressful challenges, all of which appear to be the priority at the same point, often engages men in kinds of stress that they just can't handle it, and they are not doing the things that they need to do. So helping them learn how to plan, how to set goals, how to imagine outcomes that seem very, very far away, but then make steady progress toward those outcomes. These are the kinds of things that increasingly need to be brought into and incorporated into fatherhood programs in order to help fathers manage the stress that they endure. And then finally, what right-sizing child support orders. This is the easiest one that we can talk about. We are in a space already where many states and localities are right-sizing child support orders, but the degree to which fatherhood services are prepared to become close partners in order modifications is lacking, and I think we need to develop more focused strategies as well. So why do we need to do these three things? Why do we need to develop developmentally and relationally appropriate fatherhood programs and spend more time doing that work? First of all, my own research suggests that non-resident fathers' financial support, especially, again, fathers who lack 4 years of a college degree, unless it is substantial, unless it is up at the higher end of the distribution of financial support that fathers provide, the amount of support that fathers usually provide has little impact on the early childhood cognitive ability, academic achievement, or aggression of children. And so we set child support orders, but what fathers are actually able to pay, unless it's at the highest end of the distribution, those payments aren't high enough to move the dial on the things that we want children to achieve. My own studies don't involve health outcomes, so I can't speak to that. But I do know, in terms of their cognitive ability, their academic achievement, and children's aggression, fathers' child support payments are not high enough to move the dial on those outcomes. Secondly, except for the most disadvantaged fathers, responsible fatherhood programs have had little impact on the actual amount of child support provided by most non-resident fathers, although they have had some impact on whether fathers pay something or pay nothing. In other words, the history of work in responsible fatherhood programs that focus on economic stability is that they may move a father who's paying nothing to paying something, but they're unable to move the amount that they pay to an amount that's high enough to really influence children's well-being. Thirdly, and this is important in a double-edged way, when men transition to fatherhood, they are poised and interested in making changes in their own behavior. And so at the transition to fatherhood, we can get fathers interested in doing things that improves their own behavior because they are forecasting about the impacts of what they're doing on their children. We need to exploit that. Sarah McClanahan used to call it the magic moment. But if a father has a problem getting a job, if a father has a problem with an alcohol abuse issue, etc., that father, men are poised to make changes in behavior when they are about to become fathers. But we've also learned, as a consequence of work in which I'm involved, that when men with older children get an opportunity to be related to their kids, they also develop health-seeking behavior about their own issues. So I'm working on a project in which we're trying to engage African-American fathers of 8 to 12-year-old sons in efforts to reduce the sons' substance abuse, violence, and early sexual debut. And these are non-resident fathers. And so we identified mothers of 8 to 12-year-old boys who were willing, after 8 to 12 years, to allow the fathers to interact with their children in both Michigan and Chicago. And we've been developing this intervention. It's called Fathers and Sons. And what we've discovered is the fathers who really get engaged in these interventions then discover, I'm trying to help my son make sure that he stays away from substance abuse, but I know I have a substance abuse problem of my own. And those fathers begin to seek help with their own issues as a consequence of being given the opportunity to help their sons. And so I think we already know that as men enter the transition to fatherhood, they are poised to change their own behavior. But if fathers of older children get the opportunity to help their children, they then are turned on to the opportunity to help themselves. And this is important. Lastly, non-resident fathers spend substantial amounts of time during the first 3 years of their children's lives interacting with their children. Most of all, because they tend to be romantically involved, particularly if they are people of color. But the time that they spend with their children has little impact on children's cognitive ability, academic achievement, or aggression. And that means they're spending time, but they're not spending time in effective ways. And we need to find ways to help them be more effective in how they're interacting with their children. And finally, again, there has been little effort devoted to developing and testing effective models for engaging non-resident fathers in parenting programs where there is direct father-child interaction. So let me turn to the next topic and move on. Strategies for stressors. So what we've learned is that fathers' depressive symptoms and alcohol abuse problems are negatively associated with fathers' engagement. So fathers who are depressed and those who have alcohol abuse problems tend not to be engaged with their children. This is particularly the case for non-resident fathers, often because the behavioral manifestations of depression and especially alcohol abuse raises mothers' gatekeeping strategies. And therefore, they don't want their children around fathers who are showing signs of depression or who are engaged in alcohol abuse. Secondly, fathers who have high amounts of arrears tend to be depressed. They are most likely to show acute depressive symptoms when they accumulate large amounts of arrears, and this will tend to be true for fathers who are low income and non-resident. Also, fathers who have alcohol abuse problems also are, again, fathers who have high levels of arrears manage the stress associated with arrears with alcohol abuse. And so, however, fathers who have high levels of arrears and but who have social supports, people to whom they can turn to help them manage their arrears problems, they tend to have lower levels of depression and lower levels of alcohol abuse. And so, again, we need to help fathers handle the stress that is associated with being in large amounts of child support debt. Thirdly, engaging fathers in efforts to improve child well-being for adolescent sons, as I described, has been shown to engage fathers in help-seeking behavior. And so fathers are interested, again, in managing their alcohol abuse problems and dealing with depression and smoking in the intervention that we're working on, which is called Fathers and Sons, as a consequence of being given the opportunity to interact with their sons. And finally, what I want to describe here is not a mental health problem. I'm not a psychologist. I'm just a lowly economist. But I have observed the following. As a consequence of hanging out with researchers who worry about fathers' mental health. Fathers who identify with hyper-masculine identity structures, these fathers have difficulty in co-parenting. And in the bottom line, I think my audience understands what I mean. Fathers who have been trained or socialized not to show their own emotions, who have been socialized that men are strong, who have been socialized that in their interactions with women, they need to dominate or they are expected to dominate, who have difficulty negotiating with women. These are the types of fathers, those who ascribe to these hyper-masculine identities do not function well in co-parenting context. In other words, when there is a need for them to learn to compromise in negotiation with the mothers of their children, to gain access, to agree on what's important for the child, fathers who ascribe to these hyper-masculine identities don't do well in co-parenting context. And let me take a moment a little bit to describe what I mean. There is some important research about the violence that is occurring in the streets around police interactions with people, particularly with men of color. And what the researchers discover is that police officers who ascribe to hyper-masculine identities, they are people who believe that they should be in control, that people should respond to their authority. These types of police officers want to be located in communities where they are likely to encounter crime. Because the more arrests that they make, et cetera, the more likely they are to be promoted. And so police officers who have this hyper-masculine identities want to be in communities where trouble is occurring, because in part because that turns them on, but also because it could, making an arrest, et cetera, contributes to their professional development. No wonder when you have those types of police located in communities of color, you get a lot of very negative and violent police citizen interactions. And so in the same way, men who ascribe to these hyper-masculine identities either need some extra help in working with co-parenting programs, because these are the type of men who are not poised to negotiate well with the mothers of their children, and that is in some sense the kiss of death when they think about doing so. There are some other issues. Men in general, and many fathers, whether they're resident or not, have it in they have been trained and socialized to the idea that I need to provide for my children and for my families. And as a consequence of that socialization, they are often poised to work at the cost of their health. And we are seeing so many deaths due to men of color. What we know from around the world is that men are more likely to contract the coronavirus, and they are more likely to die after having contracted the coronavirus than are women. And one of the reasons for doing so is that they will often go into work to make more money when other staff members are saying, oh, I'm not coming in today. When they have a day off and they're entitled to rest, they're more likely to go into work, and as a consequence, they're more likely to contract. And because they have these maladaptive strategies to other stressors, i.e. they smoke and they drink, once they contract the coronavirus, they're more likely to succumb to it. And as a result, we need to find ways to help men deal with how to appropriately manage the impacts of masculinity for work, interaction with children, and their own health. Okay, so finally, let me just pick up the last area of need, which is helping men to advocate for right-size orders. Under the prevailing guidelines that more and more states are developing, the majority of non-resident fathers, these are using data from my own study based upon the National Survey of American Families. Most men, the majority of men who are non-resident fathers, if they had orders, would not be able to fully meet their orders. That is to say, they would default at some level on what they are required to pay. And this is especially the case for men who have less than a 4-year college degree. And so the levels of child support orders are now substantially high, and as a result, we should expect more and more men who don't have a 4-year college degree to increasingly have difficulty meeting the child support that they are required to pay. In the current recession that is the consequence of the coronavirus, that will surely be true. The level of noncompliance is going to rise, and states are working to try to figure out how to make it easier for non-resident fathers who become unemployed to meet their child support orders, but it is still very difficult to modify child support orders in some state when you are unemployed. Moreover, some men are wrestling with, I have unemployment insurance. Work, will I place myself at risk? And so I have to choose between my own health on the one hand and returning immediately to employment on the other. Finally, child support enforcement policy has moved radically toward right-sizing child support orders. That is to say, because of changes in the way child support states get rewarded for collections and arrears, states are trying to do everything they can to lower the child support orders for men, for fathers who have limited ability to pay. The problem is that the practitioner communities, and more importantly, many non-resident fathers don't know that states are making efforts to right-size the orders. And so, in other words, the party that has the ability to set the order or to influence that is wanting to acknowledge a limited ability to pay, but the parties that are required to pay and those that support them don't know that states want to give self-support reserves. States are pressing to try to figure out ways to abate child support orders, and therefore many states are willing, but fathers and the practitioners that are supporting them are not coming forward to take advantage of these changes in child support enforcement policy. So let me get a warning on time, if you could whisper it in my ears, and so I can close up. How then would we develop these developmentally and relationally appropriate parenting programs? I think in the first place, we need to think more carefully about screening for the relationships that for appropriate relationships, and particularly screening mothers when we are trying to engage fathers directly in the lives of children. Again, I think the primary challenge is that when we have non-resident fathers before us, and I'm really concerned about the people, the researchers and the community-based practitioners who are creating parenting programs and what they have to deal with. They know that they have to recruit people into the model. They know that they will be held accountable for increasing the number of people in the treatment and control group and those sorts of things. And because they really don't understand what is the nature and the quality of the relationships between non-resident fathers and the mothers of their children, they are reluctant to spend scarce grant money on engaging non-resident fathers in interactions with their kids. Suppose the mother and father dyad, who are no longer romantically involved but are supposedly co-parenting, agree to a certain arrangement at the beginning of the project, but then when we get in the middle of it, they've had some blow up in their relationship. Or one or the other repartners with a new mother or with a new man or a new woman. And all of a sudden, the arrangement that you created at first, you can't execute later. And therefore, many practitioners and many researchers are reluctant to go in and to begin to develop models because they don't know if non-resident fathers and the mothers of their children will be able to follow through on the agreements they make about visitation, child contact, and the like. Today, the proportion of children who will be born to non-resident fathers is approaching to parents who will eventually break up, is beginning to approach the majority. That is the average child. Close to 44% of children will be born to couples who will eventually break up, and to parents who have never lived with one another in the first place. So the number of non-resident fathers that we have out there far exceeds our ability to neglect this population when it comes to engaging fathers in efforts to improve their children's well-being when children are learning literacy skills. And when children are in danger of, when adolescents or pre-adolescents are in danger of beginning to participate in very dangerous kinds of behaviors, in gang behavior, in violence, in substance abuse, and in early sexual abuse. We can't afford, for the sake of our children, to keep non-resident fathers out of the parenting game. But in order to get them in the game, we have to better understand which mother-father dyads are ready for what levels of interventions, make agreements among those mothers and fathers to get it done, and figure out ways to hold them accountable. And again, in the Fathers and Sons protocol that we are developing in Chicago under the leadership of Cleo Caldwell at the University of Michigan, we are figuring out ways to involve non-resident moms and dads whose romantic relationship is long gone, but mom appreciates this child may be involved in a gang in the city of Chicago, this child may be involved in substance abuse, and therefore I need whoever I can find to engage with my son in order to prevent this type of behavior before it really locks in. And the biological father of the child, even though our relationship is done, that biological father can be a key player in helping to help the child figure out how to avoid these maladaptive behaviors. Secondly, fathers do need to better understand, and this is the skill part, what child development needs really are. They need to understand them in infancy. So the games that I play, I have now a 3-year-old grandson, and the thing that hurts my heart most is that he's in Nairobi and I can't hang out with him.
Hey, I'm listening to this fatherhood
I had the
this
privilege of being the surrogate
Let me get
dad
back to you later
while
on.
my
He's
son
making
was
our
away
points. I don't think he's
during
trying to.
during
He's
my
making all of our
grandson's
points.
first
This is better
year
recording.
and a half.
I'll get it up for
And
you.
this was
This is
prime
tremendous.
time. I
I'll see if I can maybe
relearned
get in
everything
contact with
about
him so we
being
get
a
him on
father
Dad Talk.
by being able to interact with my
Right.
grandson and understanding, oh, when he pushes that ball and hears that rattle, child development is occurring. His eyes are getting brighter. He's learning to control his environment. And so fathers need to have skills, and fathers also need to learn that when they want to read to the child and the child isn't ready to read, they have to follow the child's lead. So often in the skills-based programs that we create, we tell fathers how to interact with children, but without the ability to actually do the interaction, there are important lessons that they don't learn. They don't learn the cues that the child makes when they make certain noises. And so only by this direct engagement can that kind of work be done. When they're interacting with their adolescent children, they need to learn that the role of an adolescent is to understand their identity. I can remember when my oldest son, who is now 48 years old, was a teenager, and he wanted to wear blue contact lenses. He wanted to have blue eyes. And I'm saying to him, what are you? But fortunately, my wife said, Ron, back off, because this is my son trying to find his identity, work with it. And so there are all sorts of things that fathers need to learn about experientially about child development that we need to work with. So I got to close down. What kinds of evidence-based strategies for stressors do we need to better explore in fatherhood programs? Anyone who's been doing any fatherhood program for any length of time knows the importance, the evidence base associated with peer support groups in fatherhood programs. But I think we don't understand that peer support programs are simply often a sort of practitioner adapted process for group therapy, for the same kinds of group therapy that people who have alcohol abuse problems, substance abuse problems, and the like normally go through. They establish trust, they establish accountability, that is, the peer group programs establish trust, accountability, and they establish ways, they give the participants abilities to deal with their own denial. In other words, I may understand that when I get stressed out, I go out in the hallway and smoke a cigarette. I don't do that, by the way, no, any longer. Or I go out and smoke a joint. I don't do that either. Or I go out and have a shot of scotch. I don't do that either, right? But I may not be willing to admit or to identify the maladaptive strategies that I use. But when I hear someone else to talk about it, I see it, and I see it in myself. And so many of the things that we in the fatherhood field are doing in peer groups are evidence-based strategies or an adaptation of evidence-based strategies used for other kinds of stressors. And we need to sort of professionalize and develop our work so that we can understand it in the context of dealing with mental health. Again, there are other strategies, awareness and meditation, teaching fathers that when they're under stress, they need to learn how to breathe. And in my practice session, I took a deep breath for 1.5 minutes because that's how I deal with stress. Unfortunately, I don't have time to demonstrate that now. So dealing with awareness and meditation as part of our adaptive strategies for men who are, for fathers who are under stress, these are things that we need to incorporate in our program. And finally, we need to cash in on the community-based spiritual practices that are part of many of the communities that we serve. African-American communities, Latino communities. These are people who are people of faith. It is part of their culture. And therefore, allowing them and encouraging them to pray when they're under stress is part of what we need to be doing. Okay, finally, again, right-sizing child support orders. Right now, there are many states who are offering self-support reserves. Do you know whether or not your state offers one? And do you know whether or not the father needs to wait until he gets into arrears before he looks for a self-support reserve? Or do you understand that at the time in which the child support order is set, in many states, the father can qualify for a self-support reserve if his income is at 135% of the poverty level. And therefore, his child support order can be set at a level that he can pay, and he's much less likely to go into arrears. That many states are offering arrears abatement. Many states allow some kind of paralegal advocacy around setting the child support order. And in child support and in fatherhood programs, the father needs to have the expertise to deal with the labyrinth that is child support enforcement. And that labyrinth is the responsibility of fatherhood practitioners. I think I've run out of my time. I want to, again, I know that you will have an excellent conference. It's my pleasure to be with you again, and I look forward to the question and answer period that's going to occur shortly or thereafter. to have a greater opportunity to interact with you. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you, Ron. We really appreciate that. And you raised so many issues that are so important to think about with regard to not just the child support and financial issues that our fathers are often facing, but how we can really help them with their mental health and social well-being.